All right. For those who will be listening to this, obviously this will be for the VBC Bible Institute, but for all you, this will be for Sunday school. And the reason we're going to use this hour for the Bible Institute is because where we are in the Bible Institute fits perfectly for where we are in the book of Romans. So we're just going to put it all together. So we'll have 2 hours of teaching that directly relates to one another. It'll be obviously handled in really different ways, but hopefully this will be very beneficial for anyone who hears this. All right. In our study of Genesis, if you've been following along, I'll summarize it this way. In Genesis chapter 1, over and over and over again, we are told that all of creation was considered good. God declared it to be good. Ultimately, he declared everything to be very good. When we get to Genesis chapter 4, we realize obviously something has happened because we have a murder takes place. We get to Genesis chapter 5, and then over and over and over, it tells us someone died. Someone died. This person died. This person died. And by the time we get to Genesis 6, we have everyone on the face of the planet, for the most part, being killed. So obviously something went really wrong from Genesis 1 to Genesis 4, Genesis 5, 6, and then as you go through the rest of the Bible, we have murder, lying, deceit, you name it. Every kind of horrible thing happens through the rest of the Bible. So what happened? Well, we all know what happened. Genesis chapter 3 happened. So we are in Genesis 3. We've spent a lot of time working on some difficulties in Genesis 3, and that's where we're going to be again today. So when we consider this, that something went wrong, when we turn to Genesis chapter 3, the first thing we discover is the who that is responsible for what went wrong. And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out who this is. Now, Genesis 3, let me make sure I just remind everyone, if we read Genesis 3, what we tend to do is we take our presuppositions that we have been taught at other times, and we come and we cram them back into Genesis 3, and guess what happens when you take your presuppositions and cram it into the text? When you read the text, guess what you magically discover? Your presupposition. Why? Because you put it there, all right? So what I tried to do is say, let's set aside our presupposition and let's try to figure out who this is. The book of Genesis describes the who as, chapter 3, verse 1, now the serpent. All right, now our presupposition says the serpent was whom? Satan was utilizing the serpent, right? The Satan was involved. That's our presupposition. So what I spent an hour doing is making us look at Genesis chapter 3 by itself and say, is there anything in this text that would lead us to go, something's not right here. I think there's something going on. I need to go figure out who is involved in this situation. So I went through a number of things. The first thing we have, it says, now the serpent was more subtle, all right? Now, depending on your translation, you're going to see the word subtle, you're going to see the word crafty, you're going to see the word shrewd. It implies that this serpent, if he's crafty, if he's sly, if he's shrewd, the word can even be translated prudent. Obviously, here it's used in a negative way. Clearly, if the serpent is crafty and shrewd, that implies what about the serpent? This is review for those who have been listening to the Bible Institute. For those here that may not be review. It has some kind of rational thought, right? Thought, rational, something. And so it's going beyond what we would consider an animal to have. Agreed? Yes? Okay. So that's a first clue. What's the second clue that something's going on here that goes beyond just a serpent? He speaks. He speaks. Now, we do have a record somewhere else of an animal speaking, a donkey speaking, but that text specifically says God opened its mouth. All right, so here he speaks. Now, the fact that he speaks and the way he speaks implies, once again, what? Rational thought. Right? He obviously has a will. He's thinking. It involves some kind of personality. Is there anything else here that should give us a clue that something is going on? He's subtle. He speaks. What else? Well, the text specifically tells us that, and I know it goes back to being subtle, but it separates this serpent from all the other beasts of the field, does it not? All right, so it says that there's something unique here going on. That's a clue. That doesn't prove anything, but it gives us a clue. There's something else in the text that should give you a clue that something is going on here. This serpent, right? Remember, the serpent is supposed to be under the dominion of the person he's speaking to, because the man and the woman have dominion over everything. So this animal that supposedly is under dominion comes in to try to get the woman to do that which has been told will bring about death to the woman. That doesn't sound like something that's under dominion. And in fact, not only does it try to get the woman to do something that would bring about death, the animal immediately begins to question what? God, the Creator. Now remember, everything is supposed to be what at this point? Very good. So those are clues from the text that allow you I want to make sure you understand this, because most Christians don't follow this rule. We come to a text, someone told us what the text is, we take what they say, we put it into the text. You have to find a textual reason to bring something outside of the text into the text. Those are textual clues to make you go, something's going on here. And when we go look, what we think from everything that we can find, that what is happening here is the serpent is a tool being utilized by whom? Satan. So what we're going to do, that's our presupposition. We believe the text allows that. I gave a big assignment in regards to Satan that the people in the Bible Institute is going to take a month to work on, but we're going to just go with that idea that this is Satan. And with that idea then, what we're going to do is the text gives us the who. Now it's going to give us the how. How this individual ended up getting this woman to do that which God had clearly commanded her not to do. Clearly he gets her to do that which she was prohibited from doing. All right? And so we're going to figure out the how. But we'll start by looking at some very basic text that I think are important to at least consider here. All right, go to 1 Peter chapter 5. You probably can quote it from memory. 1 Peter chapter 5. First Peter chapter 5, verse 8. Everybody can quote it, can you? All right. This is now, the reason this is important is if Genesis 3 is telling us that this serpent was being utilized by Satan, 1 Peter 5 picks up this idea of Satan and now removes this individual, this spiritual being from the garden, and tells you, me, and tells the people that he was writing to that we need to be aware of this individual. And what does the text tell us? 1 Peter 5:8, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may... All right, that seeking whom he may devour. That immediately puts this into a more practical case, right? When I'm studying Genesis, I'm getting a historical narrative of something that happened to certain individuals. Peter says, wait a minute, you now need to be paying attention. You need to be alert. You need to be vigilant, because that same individual is now walking around seeking whom he may devour. That means we have a responsibility to be on the lookout for this. Now let's all be very honest. We don't spend most of our time being that vigilant looking for the devil. Right? He's almost a fictitious creature in a story that we're like, man, he was really bad, but we don't really perceive him present. And there's a danger in that. There's a danger in that, and we'll see how that works. Go to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Second Corinthians chapter 11. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3. Everybody there? 2 Corinthians 11:3. But I fear, now this is Paul writing to the church of Corinth, but I fear lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled Eve through his subtlety, so your mind should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. Now here, this tells us the serpent did what? What was the word? Beguiled or deceived Eve through his subtlety, so your mind should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. We should be aware and on the lookout that our minds are not corrupted, that we don't fall to some kind of deception. So in other words, Paul wants to use what happened to Eve, which we're getting ready to read to, as a warning to us. All right? We don't want to fall for that. Go to 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy chapter 2. First Timothy chapter 2, verse 14. This is a very interesting footnote to everything that happens. All right? And it's not a very popular section in 2020, I can tell you that, all right? Because verse 11 tells the woman to learn in silence with all subjection. And I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. That's not very popular in 2020. Make sure we do realize this would be in reference to the church, not in reference to other areas of life. Okay, but why is that? Well, look at verse 13. For Adam was first formed, then Eve. And then note verse 14. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. All right. Now, again, we don't have time to go and take all that apart. There's all kinds of implications there. But the main thing to realize is, once again, this is another verse saying what happened to Eve. She was deceived. She was deceived. There was a process of deception that occurred. And so if we're going to be sober and be vigilant, then what do we need to be looking out for more than anything? The danger of what? Deception. The danger of deception. If Satan is real, and if Satan is still operating, then the greatest thing we need to be on the lookout for is deception, and that deception involves how we think and what we perceive. So deception is the thing we need to be on the lookout for. One other passage. Go to 2 Corinthians chapter 2. 2 Corinthians chapter 2. 2 Corinthians 2, verse 11. Paul writing to the church of Corinth again. 2 Corinthians 2:11. All right, verse 11, everybody there? Lest Satan should get an advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices. For we are not ignorant of his devices. That verse was used by one of the Puritans to write a book on Satan's devices. I think it's in the library. It used to be in the library and back. Very, very famous book. What are we not to be ignorant of? His devices. What does the word devices there mean? Does the NIV use devices? Schemes. There we go. Schemes. His schemes, his techniques. We should not be ignorant of that. Well, if we're going to learn about his schemes, if we're going to learn about his methods, if we're going to learn about his techniques, and if the serpent is being utilized by Satan in Genesis 3, then what chapter would be absolutely the most important to give us an outline of his techniques and his schemes? Genesis 3. Why would Genesis 3 be the most important one? Because this is where he first shows up. It's where he first shows up. And the first time he shows up, guess what? He's not 20% effective. He's not 40% effective. He's 100%. And here's what's even more important. He's 100% effective to a person who did not possess a depraved or sinful nature. Which puts us we're in a very vulnerable state because she didn't have what we all possess. All right? So that means Genesis 3 is of the utmost importance. That's like the go-to. This is almost like in sports. Well, we saw this in baseball about, the Houston Astros stealing signs and cheating in order to win games, right? Okay, and everybody got all upset about that. Well, think about it this way. In a roundabout way, we get to cheat in this game because we get the playbook, right? We're handed the playbook. Here's Satan. Obviously, we are told to be on the lookout for him, right? And then we're handed a book and saying, here's his schemes. Here's what he does. And then our job is to take it. Now, what's sad is even though we've been given the playbook, we still get deceived and we still fall short. Now, part of the reason is because we have a sinful nature. But I want you to just realize that Genesis 3 is not just interesting history. It's just not interesting to figure out some of those clever things like how do we determine from the text if that's Satan? Those are all fun academic pursuits. But it now gets very real because we are warned over and over about this individual. And now we need to go back and see exactly how he operated, okay? So, let's go back to Genesis 3, and that's going to be the goal this morning. I wanted to finish it. I don't think we will be able to, but that's okay. Genesis 3. We're never going to get out of Genesis 3. Right? Yeah, I'm going to take us a journey through the entire Bible in the Bible Institute, and I'll be dead before we get out of the book of Genesis. But that's okay. All right, I'm trying. All right, so everybody understand what we're going to try to do. Now, there's just one thing we absolutely have to acknowledge this, and we have to make this very clear because there's a lot of misconceptions. Now, I know everybody in this church knows it, but we got to make it clear, especially for those who may be listening online. If Satan is an angelic being that rebelled against God, and that angelic being ultimately was, I know from a philosophical standpoint, Genesis 3 makes absolutely no sense. In a philosophy class, Genesis 3 would be laughed at all day long because it makes absolutely no sense that the one who created the angelic being obviously knew the angelic being was going to do what before he created it? Rebel. After Satan rebelled, what could God have done to that angelic being? Destroyed it. He didn't destroy it. Now he did not destroy it. What did he let him come? Let him come to earth. Once he got to earth, where could he have kept him out of? Did he let him? He let him into the garden. Letting him into the garden, what did he know was going to take place? He could have stopped it from doing that, but he didn't. After Adam and Eve sinned, what could God have done? Wiped them out and stopped everything. But he did not. So from a philosophical standpoint, there's nothing easy to answer, but guess what? The text doesn't offer us any answers, and so those philosophical questions are never going to be answered. Right? But here's something very important to understand about Satan. Satan obviously would have one very important limitation that everyone should be aware of. Satan is not what? There's an attribute of God that Satan does not possess. He's not omnipresent. So Satan cannot be at all places at all times. Because many Christians who love to talk about Satan, well, they're like, Satan was really after me this week. So he was hanging out with you this week? Of all the places in the world, he was hanging out with you. Right? What do you mean by that? He can only be in one place at one time. All right? So, now what we can say is Satan may be operating, but he utilizes certain things to carry out some of the same agenda. So let's just make sure we have a correct understanding, because so many times you hear sermons and it's like, you're almost making Satan sound like he's God, and that's definitely not the case. So everybody at least have that understanding? All right, so let's go to Genesis 3, and let's look at the very first technique, the very first thing he utilizes. Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. And the first technique is found in the first three words. Okay, now the serpent. What does that tell you about his first technique? Okay. All right. Okay, you're all saying there. I put it down this way, but you're all onto the same idea. The first technique, he disguised himself. He disguised himself. He didn't show up in his form, right? What did he utilize? A serpent. Now, why would he use the serpent? We don't know, but we do know this. He utilized something that in the previous chapter was declared to be what? Good. Yes? The serpent would have been one of the animals declared to be good in chapter 1. Yes? All right. So he utilizes something that is declared to be good, and he utilizes something, Bobby said it, that the woman had what over? Dominion. So he utilized something that would she have perceived the thing that he is using to be any threat to her? She would not have perceived it to be dangerous. She would not have perceived it to be a threat. She would not have perceived anything about it. I mean, she demonstrates no concern at all. She doesn't even seem shocked that the thing can talk. Right? Now, why? Why not? I mean, what does she know? Who knows? I mean, we could go all day on that. I mean, all kinds of speculation. But the bottom line is he disguises himself, and I think it's very, very important, all right? Satan isn't an originator. He's a clever imitator. He's not an originator. He's a clever imitator who disguises his true character. In fact, look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11. I think it's very important. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Second Corinthians chapter 11. Second Corinthians 11:14. Everybody there? Paul, once again, writing to the Corinthians, he talked to the Corinthians a lot about Satan, did he not? This is another passage where he mentions Satan. And what does he tell them? Well, what does he tell them about Satan in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 14? He tells them not to marvel, for what? Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. What? How did yours read? He masquerades an angel of light. This gives us one of the key things that he does. Right? This is the way he operates. He does not, listen, he disguises himself. He'll make himself look like an angel of light. This is something Christians seem to always miss. Christians seem to always miss this. What do Christians usually always jump up and down and go crazy about? We tend to go, and you can, I hate to say this, but this is a good example. You can put an occult bookstore in town, right? An occult bookstore, they sell the Satanic Bible, they sell all kinds of New Age stuff. Christians will lose their minds. An occult bookstore in our neighborhood, oh no, they sell a Satanic Bible. Oh no, they sell all of that demonic stuff. This is horrible. We need to rise up and ban it and shut it down. Well, right across the street is a Christian bookstore. Guess where Satan is probably more active? In the Christian bookstore. Why? Because when you walk in, are you concerned? No, just like Eve. You're like, there's nothing. These are all Christian books. And all kinds of false doctrine can come through. We always go after the thing that appears the most evil as being the thing we need to stop. And the things that don't appear evil, we tend to just absolutely not pay any attention to. I've talked about it so many, especially when Christians, and it comes to, say, movies. You can have one movie that has clearly explicit content, and Christians will say, nope, wrong, wrong, wrong. And then another movie that they celebrate and think is so wonderful, you're like, have you given that movie 5 seconds of thought? The philosophy in that movie is absolutely more messed up than the explicit content in the other movie. But it didn't say a bad word. Yeah, you missed the message that was absolutely subverts everything the Bible teaches, but hey, it didn't say a bad word. Our way of thinking is so messed up that way. She doesn't see it as a bad thing, right? He doesn't come walking in the way people, typically will describe Satan, as some hideous creature, holding a pitchfork and a tail with horns. He doesn't come in that way. Comes in as a creature that she's not concerned about. That's the things we have to look out for. He disguises himself. He imitates. And then we're like, oh, look, there's no problem here. Yeah, there's no problem there. And the next thing you know, in fact, he does this in a number of ways, all right? He still does this. Let's look at a couple of things he does, all right? It's this idea of disguising or imitating. Number one, Satan would have no problem with promoting the idea of a counterfeit righteousness or a wrong kind of righteousness. All right? Go to Romans chapter 9. I'll try to explain this. All right? Romans chapter 9. I'll ask you this question. From a theological perspective, right? There are two kinds of righteousness. There are two kinds of righteousness, right? And there's probably more, but we'll go with two main kinds. What are the two kinds of righteousness that we think about from a theological perspective? The righteousness of Christ that is imputed to us by faith, okay, or our own righteousness. That's a simple way of describing. There's two kinds of righteousness. Well, what happens is we take our kinds of righteousness, which ultimately becomes a fake righteousness, right? And we rely on this righteousness to save us, or think that we're saved and we think that we're better because we have our own self kind of righteousness. And this leads to a self-righteousness, right? And this self-righteousness then leads you to do what? I don't need the imputed righteousness. And that will keep someone from what? Being saved. Because you can't be saved by this kind of righteousness. Paul kind of warns of this in Romans chapter 9. Romans chapter 9. Let's go to verse 30. All right, Romans chapter 9, verse 30. What shall we say then? That the Gentiles, which followed not after righteousness, have attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is of faith. But Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, hath not attained to the law of righteousness. Wherefore, because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law, for they stumbled at the stumbling stone. What happened? Yet Gentiles ultimately got righteousness because they pursued that righteousness how? With faith. Israel decided to pursue righteousness how? By the works of the law. And then they ended up stumbling, and they did not ultimately get to Christ. Satan has no problem with righteousness. He has no problem with righteousness. Sometimes we think he's out there trying to get everyone to be unrighteous. He doesn't care how righteous you are. What does he want you to do with righteousness? Allow it to comfort you and make you think that you're okay and that you're good enough. Satan is okay with a false righteousness. And what's a false righteousness? Self-righteousness is a false righteousness because what kind of righteousness do you ultimately need to be saved? Okay. Imputed righteousness. Just keep that word. Imputed, that uses the theological term. A righteousness that is accredited to your account. Your standing before God is not about how good you are. You know what? Wasn't that the problem with the scribes and the Pharisees? Did they think they needed Jesus? Why did they think they need Jesus? Hey, look how good we are. 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 Look, Satan has no problem with that. What a great way to deceive people. That's a great way to deceive people. Hey, you think that you're good enough. You don't need Jesus because you think you're good enough. Or you think, well, I need Jesus, but the reason God's really going to accept me is because of how good I am. Our standing before God has nothing to do with our righteousness. It has to do with the imputed righteousness of Christ. That's how I'm going to stand before God. And if I'm going to be judged on anything, I better be judged on that imputed righteousness, because the second God starts judging my righteousness, I'm going to be found what? Guilty, 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 guilty. I don't care how good you think you are. I don't care how good you think you are compared to all the other people in the world who's made 9 million mistakes. You're still not good enough for God. You may be good enough against that person. Like if you were standing in the court of public opinion, you may be like, that person's great, and that person is a piece of garbage and is a mess. Well, guess what? If that is the way it works in the Bible, David would have been in all kinds of trouble. Abraham would have been in trouble. Solomon would have been in trouble. Peter would have been in trouble. Almost everyone in the Bible would have been in trouble. Because, Moses was a murderer. Right? David was a murderer, an adulterer, and tried to cover it up. And then had the woman's husband killed in the most messed up way possible. Hey, take this letter and give it to your commander. And the letter tells the commander, hey, when the war happens, you will pull back and let him die. What a messed up way to do that. Solomon, we've already talked about him in great detail. Talk about an adulterer, a polygamist, 700 wives, 300 concubines, and then ended up an idolater. And yet, we study his books all the time, do we not? Yeah. Satan will deceive people with a false righteousness, because you'll start thinking, I'm pretty good. I'm pretty good. Well, humanly speaking, you may be pretty good, but before a righteous God, not so much. So there's a false righteousness. Go to 2 Corinthians chapter 11 again. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. So Satan uses disguises, and one of the things he will do is promote a false righteousness, a fake righteousness. Second Corinthians chapter 11, verse 13. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 13. Everybody there? 2 Corinthians 11:13. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. Satan will utilize false ministers, false apostles, false pastors, false churches. He has no problem with pastors. He has no problem with ministers. He has no problem with churches. He just wants what kind? The counterfeit kind. The false kind. And why is that deceptive? Again, that's why the Christian bookstore can be so dangerous. Because you go in, you got all these books, you think this is wonderful, and you read it. Next thing you know, you're literally being fed an absolute counter version of Christianity, a version that violates historic Christianity, and you buy it hook, line, and sinker. Right? That's a false way of doing so. It's a false message. And how serious is this false message? We'll go to Galatians. You probably remember this. Hopefully you remember this. Galatians chapter 1. Galatians chapter 1, verse 6. Paul writing to the church at Galatia, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel, which is not another, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. But though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. As we've said before, so say I now again, if any man preach any other gospel unto you than you have received, let him be accursed. In other words, why? Because there are false preachers who come in and preach a false gospel. There are false preachers. Satan will use a counterfeit righteousness, and he will use a counterfeit minister or a counterfeit church. And then you can go ahead and write down number 3. He will use a counterfeit or false gospel. All deception. All of those things appear to be what? Good. Is righteousness a good thing? Everyone should say amen. Is church and ministers a good thing? Yes. Is the gospel a good thing? Yes. But what happens when it's a false righteousness and a false pastor and a false gospel? What do you end up with? Death. That's probably one of the most difficult things you learn as a Christian. You become a Christian and you're like, okay, man. Okay, I'm now a Christian. I've got to try to live differently than the world. I'm supposed to follow God. And at some point you realize, wait a minute, the danger may not be out there outside the church. The danger may be actually inside the church. The danger may not be on Power 103. The danger may be on Christian radio. The danger may not be at the occult bookstore. The danger may be in the Christian bookstore. The danger may be in righteous living. Okay, that's not where we perceive the danger to be, and that's why Satan can be so effective, because he uses deception. He takes something that has already been declared good, that she has complete dominion over, and she doesn't even perceive it to be even a threat. And the next thing she realizes is what? She's no longer in the garden, right? Next thing she knows, she's got the sentence of death pronounced upon her, and the next thing she knows, her kids are killing one another. And it all started because a serpent Satan disguising himself, using a serpent in order to accomplish that. All right? Let me see if I can. Oh, well, I'm going to make you do this since we're doing this as a Bible Institute. We'll see if who can find this first, okay? Okay, those listening online, you can email me your answers if no one here can figure it out. Okay, all right, now I have an audience, so I can make you do this. All right, that's what I prefer, okay? All right, so I want you to think about this. All the ones I've given you are pretty straightforward, right? False righteousness, everybody knows that one. That's easy, right? False gospel, everyone knows that one. That's not hard. False ministers, false churches, nobody here is confused by that. There's something else Satan does, and it appears he will do in the future, that will deceive all kinds of people. Okay, if you got it, look, find it. Tell me where. Tell me where it shows. Tell me where it shows up. Say it again so everybody can hear you.
False wonders or false signs.
False wonders, false signs. We can also call them false miracles. Okay, find me a passage in Scripture that would prove this point. The Satan will use. Okay, Revelation probably would be a good place to go. Okay. And someone got there pretty quick. Let's see if this one proves it. If you can think of another passage, okay, you go to the 2 Thessalonians one. Revelation chapter 12. Okay, well, that talks about a great wonder, not exactly what we're looking for. There is a passage in Revelation that speaks of it. 13:13. Oh, here we go. All right. Revelation chapter 13. We'll go back to verse 11. Yeah, Revelation chapter 13, verse 11. And behold, another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. Even right there you see some deception going on, right? Like a lamb, but he spoke as a dragon. There's some kind of that deception thing going on. That disguising. And he exercised all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. And he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And look at what verse 14. And he deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles. Satan will use false miracles to deceive. Well, and look, if you don't think that will work, you're out of your mind. If someone right now came into Abilene, Texas, and went to the hospital and started healing people, right? Started healing people. Boom. People with cancer, children with cancer, healing people who are about to die. He goes to the graveyard and raises a couple of people from the dead. Are you telling me that 24 hours later, he would be at the Taylor County Coliseum and that place would be packed? All he would have to do is claim that he is from God. A miracle does not prove that someone is from God. Satan is going to literally use miracles. I don't know why Christians will fall for that. Look at that. That person has been healing people. They have to be from God. Don't look to the miracles. What do we look to? What they preach and what they teach and what they believe, what their doctrine. That's what we look for, not miracles. Did you have another passage that carries the same idea? 2 Thessalonians, what chapter?
Chapter 2.
Okay.
It's like
Chapter 2, verse what?
well, verse 9 is the actual verse, but you have to get it in context.
Okay. If we go back to verse, we'll go back to verse 7, 2 Thessalonians 2:7. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now letteth will let until he be taken out of the way. And then shall the wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming. Even him whose coming is after the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders. There you have it. Satan will utilize miracles. I've told the story before. I'll say it again. Before my salvation, I was very much involved with all kinds of occult type activity and all kinds of crazy things. I would do crazy things like go to the cemetery at midnight and bring a Ouija board and sit on a freshly dug grave and try to contact the spirit of the dead person. I had a satanic Bible. I did all these crazy things. And then after I became a Christian, I had not been a Christian very long. I don't remember who handed me the book, but I mean, anyone who handed me a book, I read it. It didn't matter what the book was. Okay, still do the same thing. So I think it was someone in school. They had a book called The Beautiful Side of Evil. And I was like, oh, that sounds like a good book. Just the title. I'm like, I want this, right? So I started reading it. And the book was crazy. So it had, it took place parts of Texas, parts of Mexico. I can't remember all the different places. A long time since I read the book. And it had all of these stories of these people with like these miraculous healings and all of these crazy things that took place. People had like these horrible diseases. Nobody said anything was going to happen. And they would go to these different locations and be healed. And I'm like, wow, this is crazy. But before the book is over, they basically reveal that all of the healings and all of this, they found out that there was a beautiful side to it, that it was demonically inspired and demonically occurring, that demonic powers were behind the healings. Now, again, I don't know if I agree with the theology in the book. I don't even know if the book was written from a Christian perspective. I don't even remember. But it immediately gave me this idea, well, wait a minute. Is it possible that miracles are not necessarily a sign that God is at work? Because when you first become a Christian, you just think, hey, if there's a miracle, it's got to be God, right? I mean, that's your first thought. And then I was like, wait, so then I started going back to the Bible, and then all of these passages reminded me, no, literally in the end times, how's Satan going to deceive the whole world? Signs and wonders. That's like everyone always say, how is Satan going to deceive everyone? It's not some Illuminati conspiratorial plot where he's going to trick everybody. He just got to do signs and wonders, and everybody's like, oh, I'm there. And I'm telling you, the same thing happens anytime. We see it within Christianity. Some crazy, whacked out person with this theology that is as broken can be, in many cases complete frauds, start telling everyone that people are being healed, and the next thing you know, they're packing football stadiums, making millions of dollars while they're claiming to heal people, and everyone buys into it. And why are they deceived? Because they never come and do it in the name of Satan, do they? They never say, hey, the first church of Satan is not running around doing healing crusades, do they? No. Even the church of Satan has more integrity than those who come in the name of Christ claiming to be healing people. And then 2020, Dateline, they always go investigate all of the supposed healings. Then they do their little documentary proving that all the healings are fraudulent, that they're all fake, that everybody's being ripped off. And then how does the Christian media always respond? That anti-Christian media, it's so liberal, it hates God. Oh yeah. Or it proved that those people were a bunch of frauds. Right? That's how we always respond, that any documentary that exposes, we always claim it's an attack and we're being persecuted. Or we're being exposed. But Christians fall for it. How many faith healers have been exposed in the body of Christ since I became a Christian in the 80s? It seems like every couple of years another one gets exposed. And does it stop? No. I mean, I can play sermons from churches in Abilene, like, come and we're going to heal you, and we have a healing service and all these supposed healings. And people flock to it. Why do they flock to it? Because miracles deceive. So this is as far as we're going to be able to go. I'm not even going to move on to the second one. We made real good progress today. All right, here we go. What's the first, and go back to Genesis chapter 3. When we're looking for Satan's schemes, we're looking for the how he did it. The first thing we find is in the first 3 words, now the serpent. And what does that indicate? Well, if the serpent is being utilized by Satan, then we get the first technique. He disguised himself, right? He disguised himself. And if he disguised himself, then what do we need to be on the lookout for? These false, fake imitations that can deceive us. And what are the ones we've looked at? What are the first one? A false righteousness. All right, number 2, false gospel, or we'll go false teachers. False apostles, false teachers. And false apostles and false teachers bring a false gospel. Right? And what else? We can say a false church, and then false miracles. Now, that false gospel is very important. What's the counter to a false gospel? You got to know the true gospel. You got to know the true gospel, left and right, back and forward, upside down. If you don't know the true gospel, you're going to be deceived. And trust me, everyone claims to preach the gospel. Every church in Abilene claims to preach the gospel. But you have to listen to it. Is that the historical, biblical gospel, or is that something different? I'll show you in the next hour. We're going to look at Romans 5:12. It's all we're going to look at. And you talk one of the most controversial passages in all of church history is Romans 5:12. Nobody can even agree on how to translate it. And there's 4 major views, and all 4 major views, they can't all be right. And they all relate specifically to the gospel. So you got to have the right gospel. And then miracles. How do you protect yourself from being deceived by a miracle? What's the way? Doctrine, theology. What should be most important? Doctrine and theology and what they teach, not the miracles. We are drawn. This is something inherently wrong with all of us. We all prefer benefits more than we do God. We want what God may give us. And if we think that someone can give me miracles from God, I prefer that than God himself. I prefer that over truth. We're all drawn to that, correct? That's why the same thing happens on, it used to be really popular. It's not as popular now, but there used to be, late night, every television channel you would have would be these crazy, whacked out, preachers on television saying, hey, are you having financial problems? You can't pay your bills? You're having trouble? Well, if you plant a seed of faith in my ministry, God will bless you 10-fold, 50-fold, 100-fold. So then people who are poor or struggling would write a check to that ministry. So then that ministry, them thinking that that's how they would be blessed by God. Now, why would they be even doing that? Well, because that appeals to the very thing of what? Greed. The desire for money. And what should a person watching that be thinking? Wait, what do you teach about Jesus? What do you teach about the Trinity? What do you teach about the Scriptures? What do you teach about salvation? You've got to be able to see through that. You have to desire truth in God more than you desire benefits. You've got to. And if you just look for the benefits, then you're going to be deceived. And the whole world is going to ultimately be deceived by miracles. Can you imagine you're standing there and there's all these crazy miracles are going. People are being healed, fire's coming down from heaven, and you're standing there going, no, that's false. Do you think anybody's going to listen to you? What are they going to ask you to do?
Shut up.
No, they're going to ask you to do the same miracles. And when you can't perform the same miracles, who wants to be there? How can you compete against that? How can you compete against that? You can't. And you know why you can't compete against that? Because what did Jesus say about a wicked and adulterous generation? Seek a sign. What sign is going to be given? The sign of Jonah. In other words, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. No other sign is going to be given. But we think that it so and a lot of charismatics, their theology teach they call it sign evangelism. The way you evangelize the world is you go out and do these signs and miracles, and then they will believe. They're not believing in Christ, they're believing in the miracle. They're believing in the miracle. So that's actually a false gospel. What miracle do you point them to? The death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's the miracle. People will come to get a miracle. Didn't that happen with Jesus? When he made bread, everyone showed up. Oh man, I mean, why? I'm going to follow Jesus. I mean, he's like a fast food restaurant. Right? He can make food right there. And then when Jesus finally turned and looked at them and said, what? Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part of me. And they're kind of like, time out. I don't want blood and flesh. I just wanted some bread. Okay, I'm going to go somewhere else. As soon as Jesus started saying things they didn't like, they walked away. And Jesus even said, the reason you're following me is to get bread. You're not after the spiritual truth. You're after the things that appeals to the flesh. Anything that will appeal to the flesh always draws us. And the thing that doesn't appeal to the flesh, we don't like. I mean, that's why churches have to add 900 different activities to appeal to everyone, because people don't just want this. And trust me, their methods work. Right? It does appeal to a lot of people, but that ultimately can lead to deception. All right, we'll stop right there. We didn't get as far as we were going to finish the whole thing. Yeah, never going to finish Genesis 3. So, all right, to those in the Bible Institute, make sure you finish your assignment on Satan. 5 parts. I think there's 5 parts. So work on that, and they can email it to me. All right, for everyone else, just at least think about what we've said in regards to Satan and how he operates. What's the, just for reviews, make sure everybody gets it. What's his first technique? Disguises himself. Imitation. Not origination, but imitation. All right, let's pray. Lord God, we come before you this morning. Lord, a very simple lesson, but I pray that it's one that we will give much thought to, and you will use it to keep us protected and help us to be sober and vigilant. We ask this in Jesus' name. And God's people said,